My name's Kalv, and I'm here to talk to you about ActionCable. Happy Ruby 25th. Hey! 25 years of Ruby this week, guys. I say this week because everyone doesn't know the true date that Yehuda put, so he clarified that a little earlier. So I'm very humbled and very lucky to be talking about Ruby today to you wonderful folks. So thank you. And thank you for the Ruby community. I'm going to try something, and it's probably going to fail, but oh, there's empty seats in the front. All right, hands in the air. And this will be our message to Yehuda from VanRuby. I'll post that in a bit. Please, everyone, tweet out your story. Share your story around how you got into Ruby and why you like it. I'm hoping you like it. And tag VanRuby. I'd love to, read them later on this evening on the boring train home. So I started with this, an Amstrad CPC6128, lovely Amstrad computer, and kind of got me hooked in writing code ever since. I now use this. I hate the touch bar. It's terrible. I've built some things. Most recently, that is Brewhouse, this little symbol here in the top corner, and I was very lucky to work with some lovely people in the town. I have founded some community efforts, VanRuby being one of them, the Slack YVR group. We pivoted the Ruby Slack group into that, and we grew that. I've done a bunch of other things. So right now, I'm working on GoodBits, which is an email marketing solution for people building curated newsletters. I'm also kind of interim CTO at IQmetrics in town. So why am I here talking at you? Essentially, I want you guys to get an idea around my experiences of using ActionCable within a Rails app. I want you to kind of hopefully take something away that either you can use or even have insight around, like, is this possible to use within either your apps or new Rails apps in the future? I think there's always been a bit of a controversy around performance and, does this work? What are the limitations? And I'm hoping that I can share that with you today. If not, drink the beer and be happy. Jeff, here's your 5-minute summary, mate. It's cheaper, it's faster, it's fun, and it will attract developers, so you can hire developers if you use it. So you can go home now if you wanted. There you go. He asked for a 5-minute summary in case he leaves early, so. All right, so I'm going to quickly go over some basics. As an all, I'm not going to try and talk more than for 40 minutes, hopefully. I'm going to talk about some power-ups, things that I found outside of the documentation, things that I found quite useful when developing the solution with ActionCable. I'm going to talk about some gotchas, some things that kind of hit me, or some things that I think you should kind of have heads-ups about when you're working with ActionCable. And I'll touch on scaling around some of the concepts you need to think about when you're putting in production. So basics, I have to remember there's a delay with this Zoom thing. Anyway, so ActionCable, for those of you who don't know, it allows you to use WebSockets within your Rails app. WebSocket is a connection between the client browser and the backend server for you to send messages back and forth. It's a lot faster, has a lot lower latency. It's a kind of essentially a long-living HTTP connection because it's upgraded. And allows you to take advantage of your existing Ruby code. So ActionCable allows you to use your Sidekick jobs, active jobs, whatever you have within your Ruby code base, and still talk over the wire to your front end. It also provides you a nice little JavaScript library that allows you to help manage the connections between your from the JavaScript to the back end. And and I say, why use ActionCable? Well, perhaps you need the ability for more real-time renders, or you're doing a lot of polling, and perhaps the polling mechanism that you're using to fetch data from the back end is something getting a bit too tedious. So I really don't know how this font size is going to work. Can you read that at the back? Oh, sweet. Yes. So this is the starting point of an ActionCable piece of work. The connection is what is triggered within the backend of Ruby. So essentially, you have a connection RB. Most of this, in fact, I'm gonna scan through this pretty quickly because you can kind of get this from the docs. You can get this from the README. You can get this from the Rails guides. Quick point about the Rails guide, use the edge guide, or even look at the source code. There's lots of notes in the source code for ActionCable that are not in your guide. So here, basically, I'm identifying a connection by a user, so I can reference that user later in my channels. And the only thing to note here is that, like, I can reject unauthorized connections, which is a ActionCable method that they're providing, and I'm also, extending the ActionCable connection base, which is, the utilities that the Rails have kind of provided. This here above is the channel, and essentially, the channel in this scenario is like I might want to register or subscribe to a stream of content around a comment. So in this case, I'm subscribing to a specific post. So I can call a stream for a post. Anything I then later call in the code base to broadcast to that post will be sent to the subscribers within that, which is the kind of cool part in the Ruby. So that's kind of all you need to do on the Ruby side. And then very quickly on the front-end side, you create a consumer and declare it to a cable somewhere you can reference later in your application. Then you can create a subscription to that comments channel. So this is kind of the only thing you kind of really need to remember as far as the name of the channel that you created in the back end. Rails will correctly route it to the right code and whatever parameters you need to supply to that subscription. You can then extend this. There's many more methods here, or as you disconnected and a couple of others. But essentially, those then become your JavaScript handlers on what to do for the data coming back on the wire. That's it, done. We can go home. All right, so let me go into some a bit more in-depth areas after a sip of beer. Okay, power-ups. All right, so Chrome, I really love Chrome. This made my life a lot easier. For those that you don't know, the Network Tools tab is your holy grail. You can basically filter by the frames of data coming back on the WebSocket. And you can even submit data directly back on the wire this way as well through the console. So if JavaScript's annoying you and you're using something crazy like, I'm trying to think of Angular, there you go. I'll pick on Angular. You can just fire the JSON strings back and just let it deal with what it needs to deal with. So it's pretty nifty. Yeah, it's helped a lot. So I want to talk a little bit about, oh, that's a terrible screenshot. How Basecamp do it, because Basecamp are, they're awesome, right, Jeremy? You're supposed to say woo. So Basecamp were originally the kind of main implementation of ActionCable that kind of pushed the work out and published it through Rails. There was a lot of Rails core contributors that didn't even know ActionCable was going to come out, but just kind of came out in Rails 5. But essentially the way they use it, and this is what I want to share with you as a mechanism, is less about passing data to some JavaScript view, but rendering a partial. And essentially what the great thing about this is then you can take advantage of your existing views and your existing partials within your Rails app and not have to worry about introducing any front-end view logic single page app nonsense, if you don't like that. So the point is that like if you don't need to send like some form of JSON and have a templating language on the front end, you can just render it. If you inspect the whole of Basecamp, you can kind of get a good idea on how they model it, how they define actions, and you can kind of piece together the architecture that they put together on their app. So I just wanted to quickly highlight how you do that. There's this great thing now that you can call application render anywhere within your code base and reference a partial or an object and use your usual kind of rendering and append it to a HTML and let ActionCable do the rest of the work. I think in this example, I'm just using a DOM ID to reference to update something that already exists on the front end. Sure, the JavaScript on the front end isn't that neat because you're appending and removing things, but it makes a good use. Another power up, total connections. I will talk a little bit later about different backends, but within ActionCable, You can have different backends that power the subscriptions and the messages being passed between the clients subscribed to the server. In this case, if you're using Redis, in fact, this came up the other day with someone I wanted to, so I threw it on the slide. But essentially, this is a neat way for you to count the total number of connections, irrelevant of how many Puma workers or dynos you have. So you can list, as long as you have Redis as your backend, which you should in production, you can get the total number of connections on a subscribed stream. Pretty good for debugging. This is a bit more of a hidden thing with, well, in the code base for Stream4. If you need, within your Rails application, whenever you say broadcast to, so if I was to broadcast to the notifications channel, you can override the message on every message being passed down the wire. So you can define a callback and decode the message, add something else into it if you wanted to, and render it back down. This is quite neat if you wanted to use the user on per connection to render different types of views and just call one broadcast to and not have to worry about how a user might see things differently. You can let kind of view your partials kind of deal with that, or service calls or whatever you had here. It's quite nice. Gotchas. I'm whizzing through this. This is great. On disconnect, be careful to, if you're using turbo links and you move between pages, make sure you're cleaning up one element, and I'm jumping ahead actually, but as far as the JavaScript library, it will handle most disconnects. And so actually, let me take a step back. Disconnection is all handled for you. So if you lose your network connection, the JavaScript library will automatically collect the back end. If you deploy your server to, you know, like I've deployed the Rails app, what's going to happen to the clients? They will automatically reconnect. The JavaScript library already got Heartbeat built in to know when a client is down or not. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you've got an application, to make sure to fire some form of a callback to remove your form or whatever you're actually allowing the user to post because the network connection isn't up, you know, just from a UI perspective. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you really want to make sure that the content is resynchronized when it reconnects. And that's just something just worth thinking of from a design perspective. When you're using Puma in development, make sure you're using Redis in development. That's it, really, that slide. Basically, each worker will, by default in development, ActionCable uses a memory backend. And the memory backend per worker will kind of make things work funky in development, obviously. So you want to make sure you're using Redis locally so that if you have 4 workers, when you send one message to all of them, everyone will get it correctly. It was something that took me a little while to just figure out. It wasn't that long, but anyway, it was a slide. Authentication. Essentially, the way to deal with authentication on a cable server is using your cookies. So if you're using device or any form of authentication within your controllers, you need to pass whatever is relevant for ActionCable to use within the cookie to authenticate. So you can use cookie signed, or if you really care, you can use encrypted cookies to store what's required. Just a word of warning to, like this is all good when you're using a subdomain of your parent domain. If you're using a completely different domain, just be aware that, you know, how you set up your cookies and share domains within the cookie namespace. Testing. So DHH, in his wisdom, there was an open PR for a very long time in trying to allow functional testing of a controller, an action channel, essentially, of what is expected when a message is passed to it and who would get what. He didn't want it in the code base, essentially. Yeah. So the guy, I forgot the developer's name, but he actually ended up releasing a gem December last year. So ActionCable testing is a nice gem that allows you to kind of do functional testing without having to spin up the whole server. But the way DHH really wanted you to do it was run full-end system tests like integration testing, right? Running up Selenium and having a JavaScript driver run the front end. Take a look at the gem if you prefer more functional kind of mock-based testing, is kind of a quick tip. Okay, breaking it. So one of the projects that I did with kind chap at the back there and a couple of people here from Retail Zipline in town, they're hiring, I believe. And thank you for letting me play with ActionCable there, guys. Basically, we did some testing around performance to try and find out exactly, well, like how far can you go with ActionCable within the limitations of Ruby. So, I wrote a little event machine, WebSocket connection thing to spin up as many WebSocket connections as subscribe to a channel, and then send a broadcast and time how long it took for the data to be passed to all connections. And then about when you start getting 100 subscriptions on a channel, this is not connections, this is just subscriptions to one channel, it starts to slow down. As far as connections, you can scale up. I think we got to I think I maxed out the sockets on my machine, but the connections are fine. It's more about how fast the data could be sent to all of them that became the issue. And I think the point that I just want to make here is that as long as your system is designed around not having 1,000 people in one room or a channel, you're kind of okay. And if you are going to need to define more subscribers on one channel, namespace it and perhaps send like multiple calls. And so just to explain this a little bit more, the way it works within Ruby in Rails is you have a Redis pub sub connection, so it subscribes to Redis. And when you say, okay, broadcast to comments channel comment, it then sends the one message to Redis, and the Redis sends it to the multiple subscribers that are subscribed to it. But really, within Ruby, all it does is kind of like get the message once and iterate through all the connections, because we don't do threading, right? I'm taking my time because I think I'm rushing through this. So. Anyway, so yeah, keep that in mind. The total number of subscribers on a connection is something that you just want to, if you need millions on one channel, then I'll get to a slide later that might be able to help you. Which is scaling. So I mentioned about workers a little bit. The thing to keep in mind is that it spread loads the connections for all the workers. So if you have 1,000 connections and you're using Puma with 4 workers and you're running it on 4 Heroku diners, essentially each Ruby process is only truly like having about 62 connections, thereabouts. There isn't really like any logic within like the round robin connection or load balancing within it. It just kind of picks one. So it might be a little bit plus or minus within the workers. But essentially, if you need to kind of scale, just keep it in mind that, having a lot more smaller dynos, lots of them with lots of workers, versus having one fat dyno with like a large amount of memory and 16 workers. You might as well have 16 dynos with 4 workers each. Smaller dynos, that is. Redis backend, I mentioned this. It's a given. Like, don't back it with. There are a couple of other backends as well. You can use Postgres. You can use some other adapters that they've provided, but Redis is pretty much the fastest there. Sure, it's a single point of failure, but when does Redis truly go down unless it runs out of memory? So you can run. I'm gonna freeze. Okay, you can run your ActionCable server in standalone. And this is quite nice if you find, so probably worth mentioning that everything I described up to this point, you can just run within your directly within your Rails app. The ActionCable is exposed as /cable on your app. But if you wanted to just say, okay, I'm deploying this separately as its own cable server, you can define your rackup file and just only run the ActionCable server and not your application. And that will just run it will skip a lot of the middleware related to your HTTP connections and like the front end action dispatch stuff. So proc file here. So this is pretty much all you need to do if you're running it into Heroku anyway. And then the only thing worth mentioning is that you can update the URL that's used in your config for wherever that domain or that dyno is hosted on what port. So then this is a lot more of a lighter weight cable server, none of the other Rails app junk loaded, lower memory, etc. Still limited by some of the things I mentioned before about total connections and subscribers. I want to share this. As I was doing more research for these slides, this has got a lot more momentum than I had last saw it. And essentially, anycable.io allows that guy that wrote the ActionCable test gem wrote this because a lot of the work that he wanted to contribute directly to Rails, DHH didn't. So anyway, he's gone and built this, which is awesome. I had a little play with it this week, so I wanted to share it with you. But essentially, what they've done is they've acted as a proxy over the code that I showed you in Ruby. So you don't have to change anything in your Rails app. You simply run either the Go client they have or the Erlang client. And it's, you benefit then from having that client handle all the WebSocket connections. And internally, it uses gRPC, which I think is Google's RPC proto buffer implementation. And that allows the Ruby code to call that client in a very fast fashion to interact with the WebSocket connections. So he did some testing, and it's way, way less memory. But this is for like 20,000 connections. And it's also talking about how much memory overload there is on per connection as well. Very cool. Point to be aware of though, if you are thinking of doing this, like, okay, I want the power of Ruby and Rails and type, and I want WebSockets, but I'm going to use this ActionCable. The thing to probably outline is they still have yet to figure out the support for these two areas. And so the subscription instance variables is the identified by current user example that I showed you a little earlier, which is about like, okay, on per connection, if you have objects instantiated, well, the Go client or the Erlang client won't know anything about those. And if you're doing any custom stream callbacks, ActionCable doesn't know about that because, again, it's just a message pass-through and handling the WebSocket only. That's it, really. I was just going to say that, like, from my experiences, I think the main thing that I found this quite useful for is that when I have something that I want to update in the front end that I don't want to poll, and I just would rather push from a back-end job. We had one service that was archiving a lot of data in the background, and then the Sidekick job just needs to update the front end. It's a lot more neater and fast and simple, and I don't have to worry about view layers, and like I can just render the partial or render the job, and it's done. I think the key thing to remember is that, yeah, like 1,000 connections per subscription channel, be careful. It can bite you, obviously, because it's too slow. But then ActionCable is very good. Yeah, when us as Rubyists, we like simple and perhaps nice, clean code. I like this. Then the thinking behind adding a Elixir service and an API and perhaps all the extra added overhead for that API connectivity. I just want to write Ruby, so I kind of liked it. Done. Really quick.
Thank you, Kalv. Anybody have any questions? I can run the mic over. Yeah.
Lots of questions, but I'll start with this for those of us who are not smart enough to put it all together ourselves. If I'm writing a software as a service app and I'm going to have like potentially hundreds or thousands of clients, but each client might have no more than, say, 100 to 500 users. And I want to push some sort of notification out through ActionCable. Are you saying that maybe I want to do like one channel per customer organization? Is that kind of what
Yeah,
I got out of that? Yeah.
pretty much.
Oh, well, that was an easy answer. Do I have to think of a harder question?
No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think like, so the thing to keep in mind is you just have to trade off the performance of sending 500 broadcasts to specific users and the speed at which that's going to take versus just saying broadcast to everyone on this channel that happens to be 500 and time the difference. In some scenarios, you might, that's what I meant by like scoping the domain. Like you could just have everyone subscribe to their own user channel, right? And then iterate through those that are connected and send them a message. But it depends on how much overlap, the total content. And then think about your hosting environment, right? 500 connections, and that logic that I mentioned about 1,000 connections being shared, the same applies to the subscriptions as well, right? Each one of those Ruby processes will have their own Redis subscribe command. So, you're distributing the subscriptions from Redis to Ruby onto the front end. Does that make sense? I'm seeing some nods of heads.
Yeah, so, but then if I want to configure what, like if each user still might be filtering messages differently, even though they're within the same organization, then I've got to.
Sorry, say that question again.
Sorry, so if within an organization, okay, so there's broadcast messages that maybe you want everyone in the organization to see. So that's one channel.
Yeah.
But then if I have set up some criteria that filters messages, based on what I'm interested in, then I'm going to still have to set up a per user channel.
Or
something
filtered
like
by
that.
interests or topics or whatever.
Like
yeah.
in some other code, right?
Yeah.
That just filter
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
And you can you can pass that as a parameter on the, when you call subscribe, the parameters you can use in the namespace.
Yes,
yeah. I didn't go through all, like I said, I didn't know how long I was going to battle for, but essentially the stream for post that you saw earlier on, you can do stream from and just a string. So you can construct the namespace that you'd like it to be. So you could be notifications : interpolation topic ID, right? Or whatever you want it to be. And then you use that string to only send those messages to those subscribers. Yeah.
Thanks.
I was curious if you've had any experience using Pusher before, and
I have, yeah.
how you'd like compare and contrast ActionCable with using Pusher.
So I used Pusher a very long time ago. I knew the guys in London. So this has made it, so say back then, so when Pusher was first introduced, the only other alternatives for WebSocket client activity was Socket.io. The other thing that Pusher did that you really needed was fallback support. So WebSockets were not supported by all browsers. Today they are, right? Back then Safari did not support it, IE didn't support it. So you needed a fallback mechanism, and Pusher did that for you. They had a flash polyfill thing going on. And essentially, by using Pusher, you let them handle that. So it was good for that reason back then, because you then didn't need to worry about creating all that complexity for, fallback. Today, because this is so easy, you can just require the ActionCable gem and go play. There was a slide that I took out that I will mention though, it just reminded me. It's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's about memory. And I think I'll mention it because there is a company in this room who has this issue. But basically, the total number of objects, Ruby is Ruby, right? And it, as funky as you get with other gems, you're unaware of what those gems do. So if you're using a certain gem to switch tenants, it's unsure of how that deals with DB connections, and you're unsure with how that's instantiating objects per connection. So, I mean, you know, if you're dealing, so just be careful, I guess, is a point to everyone that like whatever you're using within the connection and whatever you're using on the message passing, it will add memory bloat over time. But anyway, but you won't have that problem with pusher. So I'll loop it back to the question.
I've got a question about kind of instantiating workers and kind of routing subscription requests from clients to those workers. Could you elaborate a bit on how that works? Like, it sounds like the clients are talking to maybe your app endpoint, and then that's getting routed somehow.
So Puma's doing that for you, or Heroku and Dynos. So
let's say, because you showed a slide where you had like the WebSocket server was independent of the app server.
Oh,
so,
yes.
So if you've got that, how do your clients know which endpoint to hit to set up a WebSocket connection?
Crashed. No, technology will work. So this standalone that you talking about, what you mean, like how is cable.kalv distributing connections?
Oh, I see. So that URL gets passed up to
Yes.
the client, and they
Yeah, and there's a meta tag which is in the README. I didn't want to bother with the basics, but there's a meta tag that's like, you know, u equals ActionCable meta tag within your view that sets this config that's shared by the JavaScript library, and it references that. Yeah. So when you change that, you're good. It knows to go to cable. No, Jeremy, you can't answer the question. Those of you who don't know, Jeremy founded Retail Zipline, and I had the pleasure of working with him recently.
Thanks, Kalv.
Please be nice to me.
I'll softball. A lot of apps are metriced on their response time, like how fast they are responding, and a lot of the systems out there track response times. In a long polling situation, how do you filter out or manage your response time so that your app doesn't look like it takes 10 minutes to respond to a customer's request?
That's a really good question. And in fact, thank you, Jeremy. That brings me up another thing that I just wanted to share about that. So your question about how does the latency timing data not affect your monitoring? It will affect it if you run it directly on the same stack. If you run it as a separate standalone server, you can then have New Relic or whatever you're using as a metric collection to kind of ignore that, or skip whatever you're including within the rel server to time that data. I would also potentially say you could get funky and write a override on the middleware that's measuring your timing and just ignore /cable if you wanted to. But the other thing that I wanted to mention there, though, is the support of certain monitoring and error handling libraries does not exist. So if you want exceptions caught in Airbrake or Sentry or whatever you're using in production to capture errors, there's the agent, the Ruby agent, doesn't catch exceptions on ActionCable yet. I think I was supposed to do it for Sentry and I didn't, but yeah. So you have to, you have to manually capture the exceptions and throw it to whatever Ruby agent you're using to log the error. Thank you, Jeremy. Great question.
Perfect.
So I haven't used ActionCable at all yet, but I'm already thinking about how to misuse it. So if you're writing, let's say, an event-driven application, is ActionCable dependent on the WebSocket part of that, or can you have other components on your backend subscribe to events from ActionCable?
Oh, I haven't really thought of that. Why?
Is that crazy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why?
Never mind.
No, I mean, you could, but
I'm sure there's other things like Whisper or other ways to do event-driven stuff. I'm just wondering if there's,
yeah, you would
is
have
it just not totally, not at all made for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I wouldn't do it.
Fair enough.
So the goal, I guess, is to have everyone ask a question.
Okay, so my newbie understanding is that ActionCable comes with a library, a JavaScript library, which does a lot of the heavy lifting on the front end. You kind of breeze over pretty quickly, but what does it do when you deploy a new version of production? Does it make everyone reload the page, or what?
So, okay, yeah, I'll break that down for you. So the question is what happens to the JavaScript client when the server disconnects or, the network connection goes down? Yeah.
Let's say you push a new version.
Yep, the server's reloading. Yeah, server reloading. So the WebSocket connection will be dropped. So the browser will detect that, like WebSocket API. If you look at the W3C WebSocket API docs, that itself will fire a disconnect. The WebSocket's done in the same way a HTTP connection is done, right? The JavaScript library, the Rails JavaScript ActionCable library, handles that, picks it up, and then fires whatever callback you've defined in your connection. So whatever you want to do within your code base. When I mentioned there was connected and there was on message or received, I should say, there's also disconnected. So you can define a JavaScript callback there and then do whatever you need to do within the code base to handle a disconnect, right? And in some cases you might show a UI and say there's a lost internet connection or whatever. When the server comes back up, this is the magic piece that the Rails ActionCable library will do. It will keep trying to reconnect. So, and I think it probably plays a little bit into how the browser kind of knows when the server's backdating. I haven't looked exactly which hook it ties into. At the moment, I believe it just keeps trying to reconnect, and it exponentially grows as a timer. And then it connects to the server, and then your JavaScript connection will fire again. So whatever your connected callback was, it was like, oh, I'm connected again, right?
Awesome. Thank you.
Does it differentiate between like a connect and like a reconnection, or you just kind of have
No.
to track that yourself?
Yeah. Unfortunately not.
All right. Thanks, Kalv. Thanks, everybody, for the awesome questions.
No worries. Thank
give-
you for organizing and letting me be here.
Yeah, let's give Kalv another round of applause.